Our topic this evening is how Constantine changed history, how Constantine changed everything, we might say. We'll look at the figure of Constantine the First, Constantine the Great, and his impact on both the history of the Roman Empire, but also Western civilization in general. So when we think about the Roman Empire, I think we kind of have a one moment snapshot kind of static image. We can't help but think of things with kind of a caricature. And so we maybe are going to picture a map like this one, where we see kind of this area around the Mediterranean, probably all the way, including Iraq, all the way across then to Britain, and it'll be kind of colored in to indicate the Roman Empire. And here's another example of that same map, different color. And sometimes this is divided into the major Roman provinces. And it's often, this map is dated to the year 117. So for the map purposes, this is often called the Roman Empire at its greatest extent. So the Roman Empire, when it is conquered from the Persians, Mesopotamia and Armenia, which Armenia being a buffer state, and also some of the provinces on the other side of the Danube River, Dacia, and so forth. And so that's kind of the Roman Empire at its greatest extent, and so this is kind of where our map comes from. And this is one of the maps where the provinces here are especially familiar. This is a map that I can actually draw on a chalkboard from memory with the different territories: Lugdunensis, Aquitania, Belgica, and so forth, Narbonensis and Gallia, and so forth. Anyway, this one is especially familiar, I feel. There it is, a little bit easier to see blowing up here. So we also picture the Roman Empire, we kind of think of legions that look like this. These are reenactors. And these are legions, though, as we think about it. Roman soldiers evolved over the course of centuries, and so did their equipment and how they operated. And so usually the reenactors are depicting the early empire, or perhaps the late Republican period. And so early empire, that same kind of time period of that 117 time period. Likewise, we think of guys wearing togas, and so this is a frame capture from the HBO miniseries Rome, which is actually a pretty great miniseries. I really like it anyway. Cicero in the Roman Senate, and we think of kind of toga-clad senators and Romans running around dressed like this sort of thing. Again, it's a long period of time, and they aren't always wearing this exact costume. The Roman Republic itself, from 509 traditional date, we don't really know, maybe until 27. That was a major Mediterranean power, especially in the last centuries of its existence, with an empire, even though it's not called the empire, prior to the victory of Octavian, who changes his name to Caesar Augustus, who ends the Republic de facto, although he pretends that he's the great restorer of the Republic, and founds what sometimes by historians called the Principate, which is to say the rulership of the prince, the person who is princeps, which in Latin means first among equals in the Senate, a person, Augustus's fiction that the Senate had continued and he was merely the first among equals, when in fact, as princeps or first, we get our word derives prince, which means initially the leader or ruler of a nation. In other words, that Octavian, the truth of this is that he's the prince, and also the other title, the imperial title, emperor, and so, which originally just meant general, but now has this idea of an august monarch. And indeed, the family name Caesar becomes a title for emperor. So we might think of the Tsars of Russia or the Kaiser of the German Empire. These are both derived from the initial family name of the Caesars. and even also Augustus becomes another title for emperor. So the empire in the West, after it's founded, continues for 5 centuries until around 476 AD. But then the empire in the East, centered on the city of Constantinople, lived on another 1,000 years, falling in 1453. So if we think about that, 1453 in the whole scope of history is much closer to our own present day than it was to the foundation of the Roman Republic or even the Roman Empire. So in other words, the Roman Empire had lasted a lot longer than the time that has existed since the fall of its last vestige in 1453. So it was hardly a static thing over the course of that time period. And so if we're going to go to that period that we picture of the early empire, and we'll say, let's say, to the last kind of end of that time period, we think of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who's pictured in the Hollywood movie Gladiator. He is emperor from 161 to 180 AD, and he's the very last one of what's known as the 5 good emperors, these emperors who presided over kind of the last great era of the early classical empire. People like Hadrian, who is very famous for having built the Pantheon and also for having built a wall to defend Britain, the Roman Britain, from the Picts who were north of that wall. That's sort of I'm trying to think, the inspiration for the Game of Thrones scenario of building that wall to keep the people on the other side out of the empire. If you go from that period then to the period when we have Constantine, who we're going to be talking about tonight, who is emperor from 306 to 337, there is something very different. The empire seized by Constantine in the 4th century actually looked very different and was very different from the empire that Marcus Aurelius had left behind in the 2nd century. And there's actually kind of a pretty huge divide that separates them. So what happened in between is what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. And so this is a 50-year period when the Roman Empire was in very serious danger of collapsing outright. And so this is a period of time, this kind of crisis transitional moment when what went before, much of it ends, and there's lots of new things that emerge out of it. And so historians label periods of time, and we call this periodization. There is, in fact, no one moment when, like the ancient times ends and the Middle Ages begins and the Middle Ages end and modern times begin. These are sort of arbitrary moments that historians identify, and they say, well, this period of time, there's something very different here in the modern era than what was happening in the Middle Ages. What was happening in the Middle Ages is very different from classical history, but precisely when the breakdown happens or when the change happens is a little bit arbitrary. Historians have to sort of outline it. But in general, the accepted periodization here is classical history is coming to an end, although it could sometimes seem to extend through the 4th century. Classical history is kind of coming to an end with the crisis of the 3rd century, and late antiquity is now beginning. We're now getting to the period where the ancient world, the antiquity, and all of its forms are ending and unraveling, and we're going to enter into, after the late antiquity, the Middle Ages, as it's called. So this is essentially the crisis of the 3rd century is such an important thing, these 50 years that sort of caused that unraveling. So what happened to precipitate it? Legions on the frontier with the Germans. So the Roman Empire has kind of 2 great frontiers, 2 and 3. There's the Rhine frontier and the Danube frontier in the west and the north. And then there's the eastern frontier with the Persians. And so in the north, they're always trying to keep out, let's say, less advanced peoples technologically but that are more militant and have a greater proportion of their population in kind of tribal militaries. So the Germanic confederations, especially, that are across the Rhine and Danube frontiers. And then they are contending with another great ancient empire, the Persian Empire, at this point ruled by the Sassanids. So the Sassanid Empire, which is on the east. So in this case, legions on the frontier with the Germans opposed the Emperor Severus Alexander's attempts to essentially bribe off the tribes. So the military would rather have the money be used to pay them so that they can go fight Germans. Instead, Severus Alexander decides it'd be better in the long run to simply pay some tribute here and get the Germans out to go away and not risk a battle. And so that leads to a mutiny, which leads to his assassination. There's all kinds of mutinies and there's all kinds of assassinations and coups in the early Roman Empire. The Roman Empire actually never established clear rules for succession to the principate. So who is going to be emperor after the emperor, the current emperor, is always sort of an open question. And there's nothing like the very well-established system now in the British monarchy, where it goes by absolute primogeniture. So we definitely knew when Queen Elizabeth II died that Charles III was going to become king, and when he dies, if he's still alive, his son William is going to become the next king, and so on. The papacy, one of the other great long-lasting Western monarchies, it has now established a very clear rules of succession, where essentially the College of Cardinals vote and they decide who the next pope is going to be when the current pope dies or retires. And so there is a very clear succession rules that nowadays do not allow for much in the way of a succession crisis in Britain or in the Roman Catholic Church, although that wasn't the case in the past and there were civil wars that resulted. The Roman Empire never established clear rules like this. So sometimes the son of an emperor would be seen as born in the purple, and therefore a person who has a lot of the training and maybe divine right even, the idea that he has the nobility or the correct birth in order to be the next leader, so a son of the emperor, or just as common, if a person is a very successful general, the way Julius Caesar had been, the way Octavian had been, then their legions might declare, to proclaim them the new Caesar. And so now they are the new emperor. So there was a way to claim the throne that way, although you would then have to lead your army back to Rome or to wherever the rivals are in order to secure the throne for yourself. And there's several other ways, but anyway, the final way is the Roman Senate continues to exist, and sometimes, although in less and less capacity because it has less and less power, sometimes the Senate will try to declare somebody the emperor, and the person will try to rule that way, although they often doesn't have enough authority against or enough power to put down the rival generals who will come and attack them and execute them and so forth. So in the course of the next half century after this particular mutiny against Severus Alexander, there's 26 rivals. They're mostly generals, although some senatorial candidates fought to secure the throne, which means that the throne continues to be unstable. There are rival emperors in the field fighting each other and so forth, and this causes a general breakdown in the apparatus of the state, as you don't always know who the emperor is going to be, and in a lot of cases, people are fighting a civil war around your own lands and territories and cities, which will get destroyed often. And if they aren't getting destroyed, you may also decide, well, this would be a great time for me to not pay taxes to anybody, because they'll say, well, I don't really know who the emperor is anyway. So in other words, there's all kinds of ways where imperial power atrophies when no one is clearly in charge. So in addition to that dynastic instability, the empire faced a whole bunch of other challenges, both natural and also external. So plagues decimated the population, which also caused the economy to contract and limited manpower for the army. The empire frequently needed to pay tribute to avoid invasions, and so that policy of Severus Alexander continued, so the empire would have to tax its own people very heavily in order to get a big tribute to pay off the Persian emperor and get him to not invade, or one of the German chiefs or so forth. And in general, having a civil war cripples internal trade because it breaks down that Roman peace that is actually the engine for wealth in the Roman Empire. Essentially a large space which is all under one authority and therefore allows merchants and other people engaged in the economy to kind of freely operate. I mean, they're still taxed and so forth, but at least it's a lot different. It's a lot more able to operate than when it's a whole bunch of different little countries that are fighting each other and so forth. And so because internal trade collapses, the emperors have less tax overall, both from less farmers, less estates, less merchants, and so forth. And so they had to rely often on debasing their currency for revenue, and that was a problem. The empires also experience external military defeats. So the Emperor Valerian led an army against the Persian Emperor Shapur I, was defeated, and he became actually the very first Roman Empire or reigning emperor to be captured in battle. And he was taken and conquered, executed by the Persians, and there's a Sassanid monument here showing the Roman emperor kneeling to the Persian emperor in the aftermath of this battle in the year 260. So big, great dishonor for the Romans. So just as a chart that's just kind of showing the debasement of the silver currency, and so from coins that are much more pure silver at the beginning of this timeline here in the year 150 BC, we go ahead to 250, so you can see kind of at the end of this chart is the 3rd century, and in the middle of the 3rd century, this really collapses down. The percentage of silver content in these coins decrease. This is a moment back when, you know, to some degree or other, currency in the ancient world, as today, is based on people's belief that the money is worth something. But in the past, there was also a belief, or I'm sorry, it's also a belief value in what the metal is. And so silver and gold have sort of an intrinsic value as well. And so the problem with a silver coin is as you make it more and more out of base metals and less out of silver, it ceases to have that value of what the silver is worth, and it's only based on what people think it's worth. And in the middle of a crisis, a breakdown of the Roman state, this seemed to be having less and less value. While this is all happening, there's even kind of a breakdown of central authority altogether. So after the emperor is defeated by the Persian emperor, after the Roman emperor is and is captured, the person who takes over back in Rome isn't able to maintain control of the whole empire. And so from the year 260 onward, a separate breakaway Roman Empire exists as a separate de facto state in Gaul that also controls Roman Britain. And so it continues to be a Roman state, but it has no contact with or doesn't pay any attention to the edicts coming from the central authority, from the emperor. Likewise, a kingdom in the desert of Syria, a queendom in Palmyra, created a breakaway empire that is effectively, a breakaway state that is effectively also a little Roman Empire of the East that controlled a lot of Asia Minor, all of Syria, and Egypt. So ultimately, it's good for the Roman Empire. There is a military end of the crisis. So a man named Aurelian as a popular general who's stationed along that Danube frontier, the northern frontier in Pannonia, the area that's kind of now Serbia, secured the throne in the year 270, in the same way that a lot of these emperors during this crisis became emperor, which is to say his troops proclaimed him emperor. But unlike so many other emperors before him during this time period, he follows that up with a stunning series of military victories. So he conquers and reincorporates both the Gallic Roman Empire and the Palmyrene breakaway states. So he brings those back. He also attacks and defeats the various Germanic and other confederations that are across the Danube. So the Goths, the Vandals, the Juthungi, the Sarmatians, and the Carpi. So lots and lots of military victories that brings a new kind of renewed hope and stability for the empire. Aurelian is sort of famous and is known for the building of the Aurelian walls around the city of Rome. And so there's a picture of one of the gates here that has continued to the present day in Rome, and lots of remains of the Aurelian walls are still there. If you look at the left, this is a map of the two sets of Roman walls. The original blue ones, this is the original Servian walls from the Roman Republican time period, and those are the walls that enclose the famous 7 hills of Rome, the Capitoline, the Palatine, Aventine, Quirinal, Viminal, Esquiline, and Caelian hills. And so those were the original part. But by the time the empire had come around, Rome had massively expanded beyond those walls, especially into the area, actually on this map, that says Servian walls, so that kind of northwest quadrant, the Campus Martius. Lots of new expansion had been there, and so Aurelian builds walls in that red wall all the way around the city, and these are enormous defenses, and they continue to essentially defend the city of Rome throughout the Middle Ages. Very powerful defensive fortifications. So one of Aurelian's successors inherited a bunch of the same problems and was kind of a more of a administrative genius who helped to solve some of these. So much of the empire's older interior structure also collapsed during the crisis of the 3rd century. It had been collapsing ahead of time, but it especially collapsed there. So originally, the empire had relied on local civic nobility in provincial towns, what's sometimes called like the decurion class, to run and fund civilian services. And we see that big picture of the Roman Empire, and we think of the modern day state where, for example, if you look at a map of France, the French government has police that are part of the government that are in all the little towns. There's offices of the government in all of its different bureaucracies and so forth. Education has control over, and so many other things. The Roman Empire really didn't have that. It had a road network. It had a government in terms of the imperial court, and it had the military along the frontiers, and it had field armies near that the emperors led. All of the rest of the kind of services, local police force or civic services and all those kinds of things, those were held by the sort of towns and cities that were spread all around the empire, which were sort of operating kind of on their own the way they always had, even before they were part of the empire. So during the 3rd century, this class of local elite, the local noble who wants to be part of a town senate and so forth, collapsed because they were required to pay out of their own wealth such draconian taxes. And so becoming an administrator in a Roman city became a fast way to go bankrupt during this kind of time period. So Diocletian, part of his response is he creates kind of an unprecedented imperial bureaucracy. So he really adds to the number of bureaucrats, especially that are responsible for the different functions of the state. that hadn't existed. So Diocletian, who's reigning here from 284 to 305. And so if we go back to that map that I was showing at the beginning of the Roman Empire at its greatest extent, 117 AD, and like I was saying, kind of all of these provinces that we know, and I know anyway, and maybe are somewhat well known. So you can see like a third or half of Spain in this is like this big province called Tarraconensis. And you can see like all of Italy is just listed here as Italia because it's not really, it's not divided as a province. It kind of emerged out of, it was the center and the rest were the provinces, right? So you can see kind of these were bigger regions and provinces when they were first happening. So under Diocletian, these are all divided up into smaller units, including Italy, which is now divided into different smaller provinces, each with their own kind of administrations. And so there's a massive increase in the amount of administrative oversight as a result of having so many more little provinces than they had before. In addition to having additional provinces and additional provincial governments, Diocletian determined that the empire had become too much for one man to rule, and so he decided to make additional imperial courts. So like I said, there had been the presence of the empire had been existing at the frontiers and then also at the imperial court, and to a lesser extent at the provincial levels, at the provincial the provincial governments. Now there's double the number of provincial governments, and he initially doubles the imperial courts. So he raises a general named Maximian to the rank of Caesar initially. And so that means he is an emperor, co-emperor with Diocletian, but Diocletian's rank is Augustus. And so Augustus is the higher rank and Caesar is the lesser rank. And he does that as of 285. Later, Diocletian elevates Maximian to the rank of Augustus. And so he becomes the junior Augustus, and Diocletian remains the senior Augustus. And they name two additional guys to the title Caesar. And so now there's 4 emperors. And so that's called, by historians anyway, the Tetrarchy. It just means Greek. Greek means the rule by 4 men, the Tetrarchy. And so the division then, there's the littler provinces in this, but this is then divided into the dioceses of the empire. And so essentially Maximian, as the junior Augustus in the west, rules over this yellow area. And so he will hold his court in Mediolanum or Aquileia, or sometimes Rome, but probably not because it's a military, the emperor is a military leader, and so you want to be close to the frontier. So Mediolanum, that's Milan. That becomes one of the more important later imperial capitals. So Constantius is his junior emperor under the junior Augustus of the West, so the Western Caesar. And so he will probably have his court at Augusta Treveriorum, which is the town of Trier in Germany along the Rhine frontier. Diocletian continues to be the senior Augustus. He rules over the east, and he has his court at the city of Nicaea in Asia Minor, in the diocese here of Pontica. And he sometimes will be over at Antioch, which is the military capital for the east, when he has to have wars against the Persians. And then under him is the eastern Caesar, Galerius, who will be along, probably somewhere along the Danube frontier, that northern frontier, and in the town there of Sirmium in Pannonia. So, and by the way, this word diocese, this is why this is, this Latin word diocese, this is where the Catholic word for diocese comes from. Because over time, as we'll see in this, when the Catholic Church, the Christian Church becomes, Catholic and Orthodox Church, when the Christian Church becomes intertwined with the Roman government, they make essentially each of these smaller and smaller dioceses, they have a territory of a Roman province, will also have a Christian bishop as its official in each one of the cities. And so that's why we have this word diocese comes from the Latin Roman administration, the secular administration. So there are pros and cons of Diocletian's Tetrarchy model. So the pros of the Tetrarchy, that includes a much more responsive imperial government. If you're a provincial in Judea and you want to complain to the emperor, there's now an emperor that is much closer to you over in Nicaea than if, for example, there was only one emperor and he's off campaigning with the legions in Britain. It's going to take a whole long time for you to send your entreaty and to the emperor. So there's an imperial government that is close by. Also, if you get invaded, so let's say the emperor is off campaigning against the Picts in Britain, well, that's a great time for the Persians to attack. It's going to take a whole long time to get over there when there's only one emperor with one big field army. Now that there's 4 emperors and 4 field armies, when the Persians attack, there's an emperor right there who can go and deal with it. And in fact, it's the biggest, most important emperor that is going to be there, right? So the emperor frequently faced challenges on the Rhine, Danube, and eastern frontiers. Now there are emperors with armies defending all of these simultaneously. However, one of the cons of the Tetrarchy, you can probably just imagine this right away. We've already just come out of a period where there's civil wars and where the empire is divided and there's different rival sources of power. There's sort of an obvious built-in rivalry here when you have multiple legitimate emperors. Yes, Diocletian, in setting the whole thing up, he has kind of seniority and is able to maybe browbeat the others into doing what he says as the most senior emperor, but they're all very heavily armed now, and they all have the legitimacy and title of being a Caesar or an Augustus, and there has never really been this situation where there's emperors above emperors before, which is confusing to everybody in a way. So Diocletian nevertheless hopes that this is going to solve the overall succession crisis that the empire has been facing. He seems to have like looked back on that time of the 5 good emperors we talked about, where each of the emperors, like Hadrian, would then would find somebody who is, instead of having their own son take over, they would find somebody who is going to be a very effective and able administrator and adopt them and have them be the next emperor. The same kind of plan is going on here for Diocletian. So at a certain point he becomes ill. He decides to retire in the year 305. He also makes his co-Augustus Maximian retire. And so when they both retire, they're Caesars, so they're the Augusti, then their Caesars under them, Galerius and Constantius, those are elevated to become the new Augusti. And then there's 2 new Caesars that are appointed under those guys, so Valerius Severus and Maximinus Daza. Maximinus Daza. There's a lot of people in this one named Maximian, Maximinus, Maxentius, and so forth. There's a lot of Maxes on this thing, and that's people like that. It means, great, or, Maximus, the maximum, and so forth. Romans like that. But anyway, we'll try to make it through who all of these guys are. They're not as important as the ones named Constantine, as we'll see. So essentially that is Diocletian's plan, and then he goes and builds himself a retirement palace, this vast city palace complex on the Adriatic, at the dividing point between the East and West empires. And this, because it has its own big defensive walls, ultimately becomes, in the Middle Ages, its own city. The city of Spalato, now split in Croatia, which is famous for all kinds of reasons, for being beautiful and so forth, but as a filming location for Game of Thrones, for example, and it's a big tourist destination today, even to this day. Unfortunately, although Diocletian's other reforms were pretty good in terms of his new provinces and his bureaucracy and so forth, in terms of creating stability, his Tetrarchy system breaks down almost immediately. We have here a coin of Constantius. He's on the heads side of the coin. And on the tail side, you can see are the 4 tetrarchs. And so it's showing here those 4 guys kind of here offering a sacrifice together. It's showing the unity of the Tetrarchy. So after he was elevated to be the Western Augustus. Constantius, who had previously been the Western Caesar, determines that he's going to launch a campaign against the Picts. So these are the Celtic people that live north of Hadrian's Wall in what's now Scotland. And so he goes and attacks them with a big army. It has the same ineffectual way of, it always is a kind of attacking Pict land and Scotland or Celtic lands, because you burn a bunch of stuff. They don't have too much stuff. You go back around across the wall, and what do? And so they're still there at the end of it. And so anyway, it didn't really accomplish too much of it. But the next year, he has an illness. He becomes ill, and he dies in Eboracum, which is now the city of York, in 306. So probably as kind of a deathbed wish, he directs his troops to proclaim his son, Constantine, as the new Augustus of the West. So rather than wait for a decision from the other three tetrarchs, especially, let's say, the senior Augustus that is ruling off in the east, the army just on its own accord proclaims Constantine not just the new Caesar, but actually replacing his father as the Augustus of the West. This makes the other Augustus, the senior Augustus back in the east, Galerius, absolutely furious. So Constantine sends him the news and sends him, anyway, a icon and so forth of him in the Augustan purple and so forth, and it almost makes, Galerius almost wants to go to war immediately, but ultimately is talked down from his own advisors. And he essentially proposes a compromise where he's saying to Constantine, okay, you can be the Western Caesar, but you're not going to get to be the Augustus. And so he takes the Western Caesar, Severus, and he says, that was the legitimate tetrarch. He's going to get to be the Western Augustus. And so Constantine is prepared to do that because he wants to have the legitimacy of the other tetrarchs naming him emperor, even if it's not the high emperor. Nevertheless, that doesn't mean everybody's happy. So there's another guy in the wings, a guy named Maxentius. I told you there's a lot of these Max names. Anyway, so he is the son of that retired co-Augustus Maximian. So Maxentius, he's like, well, wait a second. If Constantius's son Constantine gets to be a Caesar, then I should get to be a Caesar too, at least a Caesar, because my dad had also been an Augustus and so forth. I should inherit my father's power. And so he was able to make that case, and he went and found his father's own old legions who wanted his army will support him. They declare him an Augustus. He seizes Italy and North Africa from the, let's say, legitimate tetrarch. And so he's able to rule that from 306 to 312. And so after 306, it's only the East that is ruled by tetrarchs who had been legitimately chosen by Diocletian. So we have Galerius, who's the senior Augustus, and we have his Caesar, Maximinus Daza. And meanwhile, Constantine, who is ruling the West, his father's tetrarchate, nevertheless, he's only grudgingly allowed to be it. They didn't pick him. Galerius didn't want him to be the Caesar, but they recognize his rule. Whereas Maxentius, they say, no way. They do not recognize the fact that Maxentius has taken over the territory that even includes the city of Rome itself. Maxentius's rule remains de facto from the standpoint of the other tetrarchs. The other emperors don't recognize him, although he is able to get the Roman Senate to recognize him. And indeed, he becomes the last emperor to really rule from Rome and make Rome be his home base. And he works and is in good terms with the Senate and so forth. All right, so we've gotten to the place where we are talking about Constantine. Constantine is the topic of this lecture, so I'm going to back up here and say, who is Constantine? So as we saw, Constantine, or Flavius Constantius is his Latin name, is the son of a Roman general born in the year 272. who was eventually, that Roman general was eventually elevated to be an Augustus. And then that Roman general, Constantius, may or may not have been married to a low-born Greek woman named Helena. She might have been his concubine. There's a lot of slurs maybe to that effect from Constantine's enemies, and so that may well be the case. Constantine was born in the Danube frontier province of Mysia, in the present-day city of Niš in Serbia. So this is again along that frontier where you're protecting against the confederations to the north of the Danube River. His primary language was Latin, and he spent most of his time growing up in the courts of Diocletian and later Galerius. So during the Tetrarchy, Constantine was effectively held hostage in Galerius's court. So Galerius was the senior Augustus. He's living off in the east. Constantine is there with him, pretty much making sure that his father, Constantius, Galerius's co-Augustus, you want to make should say Galerius is co-Augustus there, remains on good terms. So essentially, this is part of the idea of the Tetrarchy, is you send sons to the other courts and so forth so that it makes it more difficult to, let's say, totally break or get into a civil war, because you could immediately then, kill the hostage if you have to. So late night one night when Galerius has been drinking, according to Constantinian later propaganda, we don't know for sure about this story, but anyway, this is a story that later circulates. Galerius foolishly grants Constantine permission to join his father's campaign in Britain. So they're having a drinking party, and at the right moment, Constantine sort of throws in there, well, Your Majesty, this is so great, or this or that. Can I grant me this boon that I can go and have glory and be part of my father's campaign against the Picts in Britain and so forth? And the guy's like, sure, go ahead. And so he does that while he's, drunk in the middle of the party and so forth. Constantine then immediately takes off and leaves. And so he gets the permission, and he, bolts and goes as quickly as he can to Britain. Obviously, when Galerius wakes up, he sends envoys with countermanding orders. He realizes he doesn't want to have this happen, but Constantine makes his way to Britain. So, like I said, after Constantine's father's death, Constantius's troops in Gaul and Britain recognized Constantine as the new Augustus, meaning that this kind of 30-year-old or so guy who is largely untried as a general gains control over one of Rome's two largest field armies. So this was the army for the Augustus on the Rhine, just as counterposing Galerius's army for the Augustus that is for the eastern frontier. Like I say, to avoid civil war, Galerius chose to recognize Constantine with the lesser title Caesar, which the latter accepted so that he could remove any doubts about his legitimacy, which was helpful. So, for example, Maxentius, who's ruling down in Rome, doesn't have that legitimacy because the other tetrarchs never recognize his authority, although the Senate does. So, Galerius from the east kept attempting to reorganize the Tetrarchy. He had one of his allies named Licinius elevated to be a new Augustus, but the system continued to unravel, and by the time of Galerius's death in 311, the whole thing broke down and led to civil war. There's lots of back and forth, but essentially in the west, Constantine ended up invading Italy, where, as I say, Maxentius was ruling, claiming the title of Augustus. He brought about a quarter of his army from Gaul to challenge Maxentius, and Maxentius had continued to rule there despite his lack of recognition from the tetrarchs. Rather than remain behind those substantial Aurelian walls, Maxentius chose to lead his troops out into battle against Constantine's invading army, and they fought just north of Rome in front of the Milvian bridge. Maybe he went out and he had more troops. He outnumbered Constantine, but his troops were obviously less experienced and less good, and he was routed. And while backed up against the river as his army was retreating into the river, Maxentius was drowned. So Constantine took control of the city of Rome, and he immediately initiated a large building program. He wanted to win the citizens and that old senatorial elite that had been siding with Maxentius. He wanted them to be part of his cause. So, for example, one of the monuments that he immediately began building was a victory monument, an archway in the Roman Forum. And if you go to the Roman Forum, this is one of the major artifacts that has still been preserved to this day. It's on the opposite side of the Forum from the Arch of Titus. And so this triumphal arch, but he also did things like vastly expanded the Circus Maximus. This is the horse racing stadium that is just south of the Imperial Palace in Rome. And so this became really big, and as time went on, as the Roman Empire, as we'll see later, Christianized, there are ceasing to be the same kind of blood sports that are happening in the Colosseums, the gladiatorial games and so forth, fall out of sway, but horse racing becomes, really, chariot racing becomes really popular, and actually crazily popular in Constantinople and so forth. So anyway, he vastly expands the Circus Maximus. There's more of these kind of bread and circuses, as they say. In other words, let's bring bread to feed the population of the city in Rome, getting free bread that makes everybody happy, and we'll also put on circuses, we'll also put on races in the Circus Maximus. So Diocletian's Tetrarchy then collapsed totally over the next decade. So Constantine had dispatched Maxentius, as I say. Meanwhile, Licinius, who is the Augustus in the east, is able to eliminate Maximinus Daza, and that reduced the Tetrarchy to a diarchy. So in other words, we go from 4 rulers to 2 rulers, and over the next decade, the 2 emperors kind of maintained an uneasy truce, which broke down in 323. Constantine kind of then aggressively invaded the east and defeated Licinius on land and on sea. In the area around the Hellespont, so that space where Europe and Asia meet. And after winning all these battles and capturing Licinius, he had Licinius hanged in 324. And so that resulted in the reunification of the empire under Constantine. So with the defeat of Licinius, Diocletian's Tetrarchy system was effectively eliminated. And then from 324 to 337, Constantine just ruled the entire empire. And so in a way, Diocletian is often, really credited with all kinds of important reforms. And I think his provincial and bureaucratic reforms actually had much more long-lasting effect. The Tetrarchy seems to have broken down like right after he tried to get the succession of it to work. It's something you would have wanted to work. So looking back again on that model of that period of time of the 5 good emperors and so forth. And yet, at this point, it was not possible to arm 4 emperors and have them not all, want to vie with one another, apparently. Anyway, that simply didn't work out. And so it seems like the idea, would have just been, okay, we tried that, that really didn't work. And yet, before the end of the century, actually, the empire was divided again in order to defend the 2 frontiers. So people did sort of continue to see, we can't have, it's impossible to defend the Rhine frontier and the eastern frontier at the same time from the same place. We need to have a western emperor who's defending that and an eastern emperor. And that ends up happening then at the end of the century. In the meantime, though, Constantine is ruling it all by himself, since the primary responsibility of the emperor was to lead the army and defend the frontiers. A strategic location is essential for the capital. As we saw, Rome is too distant from any of the frontiers to make any sense as a capital, and so Maxentius was the last emperor who really spent all of his time there. Diocletian and Galerius had made Nicaea the capital, and you can kind of see where that is in Asia Minor, what's now Turkey. And then there's other capitals that are along the frontiers. So we saw Eboracum, the city of York, and it's where Constantine is elevated by his troops to be an emperor. Augusta Treverorum, Trier, on the German frontier, on the Rhine frontier, as a major capital that Constantine builds a large palace there, or essentially an audience chamber that is still there, and there's all kinds of other amazing ruins. Some of the best Roman ruins in Europe are actually in Germany as a result of that. Colonia Agrippina is another center, so that's now Cologne, and so forth. Sirmium, Serdica, the Danube frontier, and Antioch. So for his capital, Constantine chose a site pretty close to Nicaea, but actually in a much more defensible place, a defensible peninsula that was guarding both the land crossing between Europe and Asia, so just a very narrow strait that you can cross from Europe to Asia here at the Hellespont, and also the very narrow passage of the sea crossing between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. So probably most, let's say, strategically important and also defensible piece of real estate in the ancient and medieval worlds, where the Greek city of Byzantion had already been founded and was a place. So Constantine refounds the city and has that be his capital. It provides him quick access, especially to the Danube frontier, which is right there, and crossing over fairly easily, he can get to the eastern frontier, not much more complicated than it was from Nicaea. It's a little farther to get over to the Rhine frontier, but in any event, the focus now shifts east in the empire. So Constantinople, a new Rome, vastly expanding the earlier city of Byzantium. Constantine consciously built his city to be a new Rome. So it's not just a little military capital. This is going to be building a great city modeled on Rome itself. It includes monumental walls and monumental new buildings. Statues were plundered from all across the eastern cities of the empire. Lots of these during the 3rd century, the monumental buildings and so forth had all fallen into disarray and disuse, and so where there was artwork and pagan statues and so forth, these were all declared to be national, imperial property, and they were brought to Constantinople to decorate Constantinople. And it also included kind of the trappings that would have existed in the city of Rome, including a new imperial senate. So there'll be a senate in Constantinople, just as there's a senate in the old Rome. This is all by itself. If this is all Constantine did and was known for, this would be enough to be very well known, because this was an amazingly strategic and defensible city. Constantinople proved a very durable success. So Constantine's successor, Theodosius the Great, expanded the city and built these vast walls, the Theodosian walls, which are still mostly there today. And they held out throughout all of late antiquity, the Middle Ages, and the early modern period. The tide of Islam, when the Arabs broke out of the desert and destroyed the Persian Empire and conquered Syria and Egypt and all the way across to seize and destroyed the Visigothic kingdom of Spain even. Nevertheless, their advance broke against the Constantinopolitan walls. It was too much, they couldn't get in. Constantinople, they needed to have, in order to take Constantinople, you have to have both a giant siege army and you have to have a giant siege navy, because if you only have an army, then they can constantly supply the city from the water, and if you only have a navy and so forth. And so they, despite lots of trying, that didn't work out, and ultimately the Arab Caliphate moved its capital from Damascus, which was focusing on attacking Byzantium, and actually moved to Baghdad. And so it ceased to kind of even look in that direction and started looking more towards the east after that. And so Constantinople held. It only falls during the backstab from the Western Crusaders in the Fifth Crusade, who were able to sneak into the walls essentially and conquer the city during kind of a civil war. That the city actually falls in that way. And then from then on, after the Byzantine Empire, the East Roman Empire recovers. It continues to hold out until it's absolutely just a little tiny city-state surrounded by the Ottoman Turkish Empire, and falls because of the invention of cannons, which are just simply able to, let's say, 5th century walls or 4th century walls are not able to hold out against modern cannon and so forth. So Constantine also had financial reforms. So Diocletian had tried to reestablish trustworthy silver coinage in order to address that rampant inflation. So we saw how that devaluation of the silver currency had worked. That really didn't work. It was expensive, and people still didn't trust the coins. Constantine ultimately kind of gave up on that and instead adopted a gold standard. So Diocletian had minted a few coins, kind of show coins, called solidi, kind of solid gold coins, or they're solid in terms of their capacity to not go down in value. Very expensive, valuable coins, based in gold. Constantine now mints lots of solidi. One of the ways he's able to do it is by plundering pagan temples and pagan gold statues and so forth. He gets access to a bunch of gold, which he makes into coins. This had the effect of stabilizing the economy for people who were wealthy enough to be able to afford gold coins. Most gold is too valuable for most small transactions. And so for property sales and so forth, this stabilized the economy. Meanwhile, the poor, unfortunately, had to continue to cope with inflation as the bronze coins continued to degrade in their value and so forth. He also had a bunch of administrative reforms, just like Diocletian. One of the things that he did was bring the old senatorial nobility who'd been alienated from the imperial bureaucracy back into the system. So because emperors were concerned that the senators could potentially be rivals, they were forbidden from certain offices and so forth, and that Constantine relaxes that sort of division. Anyway, taken all together, all of these successes that he had, both militarily against all of Rome's enemies across the frontiers, internally defeating the different rivals in the Civil War, fixing the economy, more administrative reforms, creating stability, and ultimately really founding this new capital, Constantinople. That probably would have been enough to earn Constantine the epithet the Great. So not everybody gets to be called in history as Constantine the Great or Theodosius the Great or everybody, Alfred the Great. But one additional action resulted in a legacy that kind of changed everything, which is the topic of this. And that, of course, is Constantine's conversion to Christianity, which resulted over time in totally changing the empire and the course of Western history. And so, for example, we can see this imagery in Constantine's official imagery here in a silver medallion dating to the year 315 that includes in his helmet a chi rho symbol, the Greek letters chi and rho, which look like an X and a P in Latin, in the Roman alphabet, which are the first two letters of Christos or Christ. So Constantine's conversion in 315 was a game changer, and so we talked about how that battle of the Milvian Bridge, how he destroyed his first of these rival emperors. Prior to that, according to his later accounts, Constantine had had a vision where he saw a sign, an XP sign probably, sometimes seen as a sign of a cross, but probably more likely it's the XP sign, where it said, in this sign you will have a victory. And so according to those accounts, he had his soldiers put that symbol on their shields and use that, the symbol of the Christian God, to bring him victory, which announced to him, or was a sign to him, that this God, he was favored by this God, and this God had real power. And so whether or not Constantine knew much about what Christianity was about, at this point, he probably didn't. Christianity, in its earliest form, if we look at what we've talked about, the Gospels, what Jesus is proclaiming, and so forth, this is pretty alien now to what Constantine is understanding. Nevertheless, this is his understanding of it at this moment. So, what was the Christianity that Constantine converted to or inherited? So, as we've seen in past lectures, our Lost Christianities lecture, prior to Constantine, there was not one single Christian church, but rather there were multiple Christianities. And so the Christian movement, what became known as the Christian movement, might have originally called themselves the poor. They're sometimes called the poor of Jerusalem, people who were followers of Jesus, people who were followers of John the Baptist, people who were followers of Jesus' brother James. And they were initially a sect of Judaism that was especially interested in living. There was a central community that was living a sort of an ascetic, kind of almost monastic or sort of Franciscan-like way, where there are people who have renounced property and who are instead living a spiritual life of prayer, and then there's a community around them that is supporting that movement. And that movement is also concerned about inviting people from the margins to be included in the community as instead of excluded. But they continue to observe Jewish law and are a sect of Judaism, and groups of Christians who prioritize that continue to exist. And we've seen that some of that, one of them as being called variably, they'd be called Ebionites sometimes, from a Hebrew word meaning the poor. And that continues on for a time. Meanwhile, converted to Christianity or converted to testimony that Jesus was the Messiah is a Pharisee named Paul, who becomes kind of a self-appointed apostle and begins preaching Christianity as he understands it, based on the authority that he's had in that vision. And this he's a missionary, a very active missionary, and he also creates a whole school of missionary companions who plant churches, which are especially good at recruiting or converting Greek-speaking pagans who are called God-fearing people. So people who are interested in Judaism, and they're interested in the Hebrew Bible and worshiping the Hebrew God, but they're not Jewish by background, and they're not interested in all of the different observances of Jewish law, for example, being circumcised and so forth, keeping kosher. Paul tells them, well, guess what? You don't have to do any of that in order to do that, because Christ has come and he has fulfilled the law, and so now we don't need to do that anymore. And so that creates an explosion of converts compared to the original Jewish sect in the Paulist church. Then there are additional variations in terms of Marcion, Valentius, Marcionism, Gnosticism, where we take it even a little further when Christianity starts to now become not just a Jewish sect, but its own religion. How much relationship should we have with the Old Testament, with the Hebrew Bible, and so forth? Marcion says essentially none, and the Gnostics is generally as well, which they see the God of the Old Testament as evil, and so forth, not the true God, and they want to reject most of the Jewish components and want to have kind of a more fully Greek, let's say, Christianity. And the Gnostics are essentially very, very spiritual, and they create a spiritual mythology and that is more dependent on Platonism, for example, than on the Jewish tradition. So anyway, in other words, there's a whole bunch of these different Christianities that are rivals even in the first century, and Constantine, and these continue on by the time we get to Constantine. But there's also additional disputes within the proto-Orthodox group, the group that emerges out of the Paulist Church. So, as part of his response to the crisis of the 3rd century, the Emperor Diocletian, who created the Tetrarchy, if we remember, he also promoted religious reform. So he also saw one of the problems in the division of the empire here is disunity because we have abandoned the old traditional gods of the Greco-Roman religion, and instead we have all of these alien traditions like Mithraism, like Isis cult worship, Christianity, and so forth. These are alien traditions, and so he suppresses them and persecutes Romans who will not renounce this tradition and prove that they're willing to worship the old gods. So essentially worship the divine. You take a little thing of incense and you put it before an altar to show your respect or your veneration of the emperor, and so forth. And so that little bit of practice is something most Christians won't do, and so because they consider that to be blasphemy for the true God, it's essentially worshiping idols and so forth. However, some of them are more pragmatic. And so, for example, in the African provinces of the Roman Empire, rather than be tortured or killed, many of the clerics and bishops even pretended to renounce their faith, so they went through the motions and didn't get thrown to the lions. However, when Diocletian's persecutions ended, the people who really did stand firm, the people who are being martyred and the people who are their family members and so forth, led by a guy named Donatus Magnus, they proclaimed everybody who had kind of pretended and so forth, those were collaborators, those are heretics. And so a big schism occurs, especially in North Africa, between the folks who essentially had collaborated and said, look, I don't want to get killed over this, I'm still a Christian, but we didn't want to, the government was being crazy, and the kind of people who were like saying, no, we have to, Christ was killed, come on, he stood up. If we're going to worship the idols, you're not true Christians. And so the Donatists more or less said that all of the ordinations, all the baptisms, all the sacraments that are performed by the previously lapsed bishops and clerics, all the ones that they did don't count. And so unfortunately that had the effect of dividing that into two churches and calling into question even people's being members and baptized, whether they're truly married and so forth. Okay, so that's one of the things, the Donatist controversy. That's alive and well at the time Constantine joins. Another is just further wrangling over the idea of Trinity. So what is the relationship between the Creator, Christ, and the Holy Spirit? Christians are absolutely monotheists, and yet they are understanding three persons here as God, and how do they understand that? Just very difficult for Christians to understand even the idea of Trinity, mostly even today. And also it's very divisive among Christians, especially in antiquity. I think it's still divisive today, but people don't split up as much over it. They just have their own belief, and people say, okay, whatever, and so forth. So I think that it's still very confusing to people. But essentially, at this point, there is a compromise position or a different position, an idea that is maybe easier for people to understand. A theologian named Arius proposes that Christ is divine, he's saying, but Christ is not co-eternal with the Creator, with God. So there is a time period when God exists and Christ does not exist. Christ is begotten. This is before time even, though. Let's say there is, before the rest of creation, Christ is begotten by the Creator, and now Christ exists. So then Christ has not always been, in other words. So this is a way to assert a stronger monotheism in the sense of there's really the God that we're going to be focusing on is God, creator, and Christ is a kind of divine person, but it is not the same as, but doesn't have to be understood somehow mystically to be the same as God. Not the same as the creator, obviously, since that's against the Trinity doctrine too. So anyway, this proposal by Arius is popular. It actually, Arian missionaries end up converting all the Germanic tribes. So the Goths and everybody and the Vandals all become Arians, which has a problem later that's outside of the scope of this lecture. But anyway, but it's strongly rejected by counter-theologian Athanasius, who is promoting what becomes the Nicene doctrine of the Trinity, along with other proto-Orthodox leaders. And so, for example, this is an Eastern painting depicting Arius, who is attending the church council at Nicaea, and St. Nicholas, who's so angry with him for saying all of this Arian stuff, has come and punched him in the middle of this church conference. And so that's St. Nicholas of Myra, Santa Claus, as he's later known. And so if you ever wondered if Santa Claus, I don't know, he was kind of mean to Rudolph in that special too, right? So he has got a temper on him, St. Nicholas. So there was no, like I say, one structure of the church. It was not like the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, was in charge, and then over top of the Bishop of Antioch, Alexandria, Corinth, Ephesus, and so forth when Constantine took over. Rather, it's more like, instead of that, it's more like there were all of these bishops of all of these different cities who were largely autocephalous, which means they're the head of their own sort of structures and are generally equal. The Bishop of Rome had the argument that they were the first among these equals, but essentially there was no structure to compel uniformity, and that really resulted in multiple Christianities. In some cases, there were whole separate church structures, as we saw with the Donatists, who would have their own rival hierarchies to the non-Donatist church structure. But in a lot of other cases, like with the Gnostics, they're just kind of snuck in and having their special Gnostic teachings within the structure of an individual diocese. So Constantine inherited a church without structure, was divided about its most basic doctrines. So one of his solutions to that is to call a council of the bishops. So the church is divided into these co-equal bishops. They disagree. Constantine's solution is something new. He summons them all together to form an ecumenical, which just means in Greek, worldwide council, and over which he presides as emperor. The council defines Orthodox or Catholic beliefs and creates the Nicene Creed, which is essentially a definition of the Trinity. So how are we all to understand and formulate what we mean when we're talking about the Trinity? We believe in one God. There are three persons, and God the Creator is not the same. God is God. Jesus Christ is God. The Spirit is God. Christ is not the Spirit. The Spirit is not the Father, and so forth. The council defined alternate beliefs like Arianism as heresy and condemned Arianism particularly. And we saw St. Nicholas was there punching Arius. The council also creates a hierarchy with metropolitan bishops above bishops. And so this becomes part of the church's toolkit. And so there are general or ecumenical councils of the church are convened by emperors and then over the course of the next several centuries. And the churches still do this. So the Catholic Church, all by itself, which considers itself Catholic or universal, even though it's out of communion with the Eastern churches and the Protestant churches, held one of these councils in the 1960s. It was called the Second Vatican Council, or Vatican II, the second council to be held on the Vatican Hill in the city of Rome. So, so again, one of these kind of councils, like the Council of Nicaea. So, as I say, there had been these, all the bishops were equal. Now Constantine creates a little bit more administrative structure. So now there are metropolitan bishops. So the Bishop of Rome is essentially the archbishop over the bishops of Milan and Carthage and Ravenna. The Bishop of Constantinople is over Nicaea, Ephesus, Adrianople. The Bishop of Antioch is over Caesarea, Laodicea, and Edessa, and so forth. And there is also now kind of an emerging org chart where the ecumenical council that is called by the emperor is also over top of and makes decrees for all the bishops, all in the archbishoprics, and that is presided over by the Roman emperor, by Constantine. So this causes a remarkable transformation. So before Constantine converted, less than 10% of the population of the Roman Empire were Christians. This was not a particularly influential group. It's an obvious and noticeable group. It's a group that that different emperors had chosen either to work with or work against, but it wasn't necessarily anything that would bring you, there's no particular reason to imagine that you'd convert to this religion the way Constantine did. He seems to have done it out of, an actual personal conviction. It may not have been based on what the religion was really about, but it could have been, like I say, based on this idea that it had brought him, that Christian God had brought him victory. So if we just look in the transformation of that population over the course of the next 3 centuries, the population of the Roman Empire and its successor states in the West, now it's the pagans who are a minority of the population, and everybody's been Christianized. So this is a huge transformation, at least nominally. So how did it happen? Why did it happen? What changed? What stayed the same? Just in a way, we've just talked about what Christianity was. I want to say a little bit about what paganism was. So in Western civilization, the vantage from which we view the past is kind of built on Christian conceptions. Even though we say Western civilization, that phrase is largely a secularized euphemism for the older term, Christendom. So we would have probably been saying that anyway a while ago. And even if we replace AD with CE, like I often do when we're talking about biblical texts especially, the underlying number and count remain the same. So because of our history, we view the idea of religion itself usually with Judeo-Christian lenses. So what's paganism? Although Jesus and his followers emerged from the rural culture of Galilee, and we'll talk about that a lot next week, Christianity from Paul onwards spread largely as an urban phenomenon. And when Nicene Christianity became the state religion of the Roman Empire under Constantine's successor, Theodosius the Great, the guy who built the Theodosian walls of Constantinople, who ruled a couple generations later, temples in the cities were destroyed or repurposed as churches, as the old religion increasingly relegated to the rural peasantry. The Latin word for rural peasantry are the pagani. That's where we get the word paganism. So pagan began to acquire its meaning. So nobody would have called themselves pagans in antiquity. It only begins to be called that as a religious divider after the mid-4th century, after the Christians had really won, either because the remaining pagans were viewed as, hicks from the sticks, or alternatively because they were outside the bounds, the paganness of the Roman Christian community. I think it's probably a slur, so which is one of the reasons why we don't usually always use the word pagans. We sometimes say polytheist, but the reality is that even saying polytheist is using a Christian lens. Polytheists didn't consider themselves polytheists. You only think of yourself as a polytheist after monotheists tell you that having more than one God is wrong. So because of the survival that we know about of classical literature, much of our exposure to Roman paganism is through Greek mythology. We have a whole lecture, it's one of the most popular ones, about separating Greek and Roman mythology. And so we're probably also aware of the systematized pantheons of the Greco-Roman syncretism, where Zeus, the Greek god, is understood to be the Roman god Jupiter, Athena is Minerva, Ares is Mars, etc., even though they actually have different origins and are later syncretized together in the later empire. Literature survives, unlike the lived experience of the non-literate masses, and our Christian focus on text. So the fact that Jews, Christians, and Muslims focus on text, scripture, as well as correct teaching, orthodoxy, neither of those is actually particularly central for paganism. So it's not really about text. Homer and Virgil are very revered, but pagans don't have something like the Bible or the Quran. Lived paganism was much more than the mythology or the relationships in the pantheon, the sort of charts that we make of which gods are related to which gods and so forth. While syncretism allowed pagans to get along in a shared worldview, actually it's the individual practices that were mattered to them for real, and they were highly localized. So Jupiter may have been understood to be Zeus when a Latin Roman is talking to Greeks, but his worship in Rome is particular to Rome. And Roman paganism is primarily about ritual observances rather than doctrine. And in Rome especially, these were performed very legalistically as a contract between divine forces and humans. And so the Roman formula was do ut des, which means I give that you may give. So it illustrates how Romans thought about things like animal sacrifice. In other words, they're sacrificing in order that the gods are then also going to give them something in return. But it also is their thinking behind just a comprehensive ritual behaviors that accompanied all lived activity for Roman pagans. The Romans also had no concept of the separation of the church and state. The state was intimately connected with religious ritual activity. The Republic and later in its assemblies, and later the empire and its officers are sacred, and politicians filled public priesthoods. So, for example, Augustus here, who's the first emperor, this is a picture of him acting as a priest. And all the difference is for the Romans between a senator and a priest is if you take your toga and you kind of put it up over your head like that, now you're acting as a priest. All time and space, the calendar is part of the pagan religion. The sacred boundaries of Rome, those are all governed by pagan religious observance. Nowadays, because historically there's a Christian connection that's of sex and sin, and much more recent Anglo-Protestant moralizing against alcohol, that's left many people in the post-Christian world with the idea that paganism is like a lot more fun than Christianity, and a lot of them have wished that Christianity hadn't displaced paganism. However, postmodern person would actually find the penetration of ritual obligations into every aspect of personal, familial, and civic life to be decidedly unfun. So there's just so much obligatory custom in every aspect of a person's life in paganism. And as we've actually seen in a lecture, we had a lecture on Christianity and sex. It's not so much Christianity it's not so much inherent in Christianity that this kind of attitudes towards sex. Rather, this was an attitude that was emerging in Greco-Roman philosophy, the later Roman moral philosophy that impacted Christianity, and it was also impacting paganism at this time. I'll just say quickly in terms of like how this is just intertwined with life. There are so many components of paganism. So personal rituals, you're crossing your fingers, saying Gesundheit when somebody sneezes. You are living dutifully to family. You are having reverence for your ancestors. The Romans have wax masks of their ancestors who were revered. There's obedience to sacred and civic law, expiation for ill omens. So some sign has happened, you have to do something in order to prevent that from occurring in your life. Offering sacrifices to the gods in order so that they'll do something in return. Continually consulting auspices and oracles to make sure that If you plant a crop, it will not be destroyed, and so forth. Praying to the gods, reverence for cult objects, statues that are both in temples, but also your household gods, your little statues that you carry around with you for fortune and luck, civic rites, so assemblies, parades, initiation into shrine cults, military confraternity memberships. So you would all of the guys you go drink with at your local tavern, you're all part of a confraternity, and you're the Brotherhood of the Crossroads, and you keep up certain duties, like maybe you provide burial services for each other so that your ghosts, aren't haunted and so forth afterwards. These are all necessary things in the scary world of paganism. To participate in civic festivals. You do hear about the myths in the poetry, the stories about the gods. There's concern for astrology, sort of the more intellectual component, sometimes intellectual. It's really not separated from astronomy at this time. Markets, so whether or not just trade is all done as part of the religion. Watching civic games, we talked about bread and circuses, and also that decurion class that had to pay for the games and the circuses. Watching and providing for plays. So all of these things, sports and entertainment, those are all part of religion in this all-encompassing thing that religion was for the pagan Romans. Same thing, studying philosophy, ethics of dealing with others, personal morality and austerity. These were things that weren't part so much or connected to things like the mythology or things like the rituals of offering sacrifices, but they had become important as some of the earlier practices don't seem to have provided a lot of meaning. What is the meaning of life in all of this? So that's all of this integrated system of paganism. Why did it break down? So in some ways, monotheistic religions struggle with the problem of evil, which is, if there is an all-powerful good God, why does God allow all of this suffering in the world? Why is there a Holocaust? Nevertheless, paganism doesn't have that. You can say, essentially, you've suffered even though you did everything right by your main god, Mars, but then you accidentally wronged Neptune, and he made your ship go astray, and so forth. So in other words, there's competing forces. That can explain the problem of evil. Nevertheless, paganism struggles with the problems of impiety, which is to say, faithful observance of religion obligation. So why do the impious people find divine favor? Why are the pious made to suffer? Aren't all of these customary obligations that we're doing, like sacrifices, aren't those hollow? Is blind obedience to duty good, or is good life lived through ethical behavior? So the moral philosophers that have emerged question the traditional religion and deconstruct the traditional religion. And this is all part of sort of the challenge of world religions. So in kind of broad terms, the earliest religions usually are understood to be things like animism. And animism is the idea that essentially all animals and things are possessed of spirits or energy. Animism explains why things happen kind of for people prior to having an organized religion. Animism is probably just operating, in very small hunter-gatherer groups where shamans are able to capture the energy that spirits or animals have through rituals, such as going into a trance and so forth. And in animism, life is kind of filled with the constant fear of succumbing to harmful forces. Paganism is another layer that develops in places that have especially agricultural societies. So when you have a big state society, divine forces are often anthropomorphized as kind of human-like gods, Jupiter, Venus, and so forth. Gods are not ethically predictable, but you can propitiate them. So you give them sacrifices in order for them to make sure that you're able to get pregnant or something like that. Whatever the goal that you have, you can propitiate them and have them not bring their thunderbolts on you and so forth if you do it right. magistrate classes perform the rituals like sacrifice and augury. So we saw how Augustus puts his robe up and suddenly he's a priest. And life is really about obedience to law through proscribed behaviors. You do these kinds of things. If you sneeze, you say Gesundheit. If you do something wrong, you cross your fingers, you step on a crack, you break your mom's back, you knock on wood. You do all of these kinds of ritual behaviors in order to propitiate the different gods. So world religions come from the later idea that there's a source of order in the universe. So once you've been studying the heavens and you sort of see that things like the seasons and tides and all these kinds of things are very, very predictable. Even eclipses can be predicted. Something is beyond just these chaotic forces of the individual gods that you were associating with rivers and lightning and so forth. There's something bigger than that. And so the idea in world religions is that individual actions and knowledge are important to that source, that one source to God. Philosophers and other reformers are calling for real ethical behavior as opposed to simply the traditional things, the traditional rituals like sacrifice that are simply propitiating or causing the gods to continue to make the world continue to function. Now we're saying, wait a second, we really need to be doing things like caring for widows and orphans and so forth. And these are also about concern beyond self, clan, and city and your present life. So people start to have concerns with, is this all I am? Is there nothing more? Am I about to die? What happens after death? Is there anything after death? And so forth. So was Christianity's triumph inevitable when Constantine converts and the later emperors continue and ultimately make Christianity the state religion of the Roman Empire? So if we kind of even accept that proposition that I had in talking about like a general development from animism to paganism to world religion, and the idea that paganism represents a more primitive stage of religious development, does that mean really paganism fall to a world religion was inevitable, whether it was going to be Christianity or Mithraism or any other sort of mystery religion or Manichaeism, any other number of ones that might have been available, Buddhism. Although we really enter here into the hazards of counterfactual, can we envision a sequence where the Roman Empire remained pagan? And so I think that there are, because we have counter examples. So there are survivals of old gods, the old religions, in historic societies in India and Japan. Both of these encountered world religions and the old gods adapted. So in the case, for example, of Hinduism in India or Shinto in Japan, in India, the proto-Hindu religions, which are effectively Indian paganism, they reacted to the world religion of Buddhism, which evolved the pagan roots into a evolving religion of Hinduism, even though it wasn't called that yet. But it has essentially taken some of these ethical ideas and other ideas, universal ideas that it has encountered and built those into the tradition. And then it encountered another very serious threat of a world religion, Islam, when Islam enters into the subcontinent and conquers the northern component of it. In response, Hinduism itself emerges as its own kind of world religion that has the features of world religions. So Hindu paganism met those challenges from those world religions and ended up absorbing some of their characteristics, retains many of the ancient traditions while evolving to become a world religion of its own. And there's a similar, although also complicated, path for Shinto in Japan. So I talked about that crisis of the 3rd century that caused essentially the periodization even of classical history to end and to late antiquity to start beginning. The empire was divided by all these civil wars, and it had political, economic crises, but it also had a spiritual crisis. And so much of Roman paganism was civic, It relied on those local Roman magistrates, the decurions, so not only for local government, but also to hold the other offices, pay for things like games and religious festivals, to pay for the upkeep of temples. They don't have a clergy. It's those same state officials that are maintaining the highly localized expressions of paganism, the old religions. By the 3rd century, it was just increasingly difficult to find any decurions who wanted to shoulder this expense. And so, in fact, actually, just as an example, there's almost no public building for decades during this whole crisis. Romanism is, you think of Roman civilization as about building amphitheaters and aqueducts and all of these kinds of public buildings. That all stops during this whole crisis time. And that also prevents a lot of what pagan practices had been. So there's potentially an alternative path. So if the pagan Roman Empire, which encountered what is functionally the world religion of Greek philosophy, that could have potentially created a philosophical pagan Roman Empire, in other words, where the old gods are maintained. So if local leaders increasingly turned away from civic expenditure, including pagan rites, to find other spiritual meaning, the era of this late antiquity becomes actually the great age of popular practical philosophy. More people are interested in philosophy by a percentage of the population in the later Roman Empire than almost any other time in history, if you think of philosophy as separate from religion. So it's conceivable, given time, that a Roman world religion might have evolved out of a combined reverence for the old gods with something like Stoic morality. So although nominally the same, the religion would nevertheless be very different from the original religions of people like Pliny the Elder and other Romans from the Republican and early Imperial period. So why do we have that? Why did it go to a Christian Roman Empire rather than a philosophical pagan Roman Empire? And so, like I say, the answer here is Constantine, which is the whole source of how Constantine changed everything. So while the emperor's general religious evolution might have been inevitable, we might have had that philosophical pagan Roman Empire and a philosophical pagan world religion, Constantine's conversion just had massive ramifications for the particular path that was taken. Like I say, I think that his conversion appears to be personal and genuine, because I don't think that there's much he gained from it. Although historians have argued that there's various economic and political motives, any of the gains that he had on this front seem to at best have balanced losses. There's not everybody, he's losing a lot of things by abandoning Rome's traditional gods as well, including lots of people who have been committed to their history and so forth. Constantine's long and successful reign gave him time to make Christianity more palatable. He also, by creating those structures, as we saw with the ecumenical council and a hierarchy and so forth, he actually created a kind of an actual apparatus that paganism lacked. And so he, over time, made Christianity more palatable to the imperial elite, and he simultaneously gave the religion time to take root at the center. The short, failed reign of his nephew, Julian, who was left Christianity and wanted to instead create a revived pagan religion, state religion. That might have been possible if Julian hadn't been killed. So his reign was too short to do that. But because Julian failed, that pretty much made the path inevitable. So patronage by all later emperors is really the single most important factor of Christianity's victory over paganism. And so Rome, like we said, had long since ceased to be the administrative capital. Now Constantine built a new capital, and in addition to being centered with all of these new buildings, a new senate and all those things, it's also based on, not on pagan temples and so forth, but on new Christian monuments. And so by essentially starting over here in Constantinople, he's able to make this be the center of a new imperial understanding and identity. So just to add on a little bit, there are other strengths. So while philosophy required significant education, Christian leaders, so Constantine in the Council of Nicaea, formulated a doctrinal creed that anybody could memorize. So you can learn the complicated thing about having Christ and the Spirit and the Creator, the Father, being in a homeostatic union or something like that by memorizing that. And so therefore it's not, it's formulated to reach the peak popular masses as opposed to philosophy, which requires a lot of education. Christian bishops who were patronized by imperial governments, they led churches in cities that provided for social services. So for example, alms for the poor, other works of charity that previously weren't part of the civic administration or which had collapsed because of the lack of having a secular civic government. And so this was seen as a really positive thing in the community that this little bit of social safety net is taking place. Also, zealous Christian monks and hermits performed all sorts of feats of self-mortification at this time that just kind of amazed contemporaries. And so, for example, Simon Stylites lived 47 years on top of a pillar, continuously fasting and starving himself, and he's up there essentially exposed to the elements. This was showing people anyway, this caused a sensation. This guy must really have amazing faith, and God must really be with him if you're doing these kinds of miraculous things. The same zeal and sense of spiritual power that allowed monks to live on top of these columns also animated their desire to smash pagan shrines. And so this was a problem. So if a monk comes up to your holy tree and he chops it down, or if he smashes the statue of the god, why doesn't the god strike down the Christian monks who desecrated shrines like this? And so anyway, I mean, that was an argument that was made. It's obviously a very cruel desecration and destruction of ancient traditions and things like that these zealous monks are doing, but that's what they're doing. And it was, and it caused a lot of people to say, yeah, well, I guess he wasn't there there wasn't anything there to stop them. So all of the different rituals that you'd had to propitiating the gods, it turns out you could actually chop their tree down and they wouldn't have done anything to you. So ground that had been holy to pagans was frequently Christianized. And so you take that shrine once you've gotten rid of the statue, you bury a Christian martyr on the site, and all the old ladies that keep coming to it for the same rituals that they always have, now they're sort of Christians because they're coming to a Christian shrine because it's now on the same site. Pagans also lacked paid clergy. There was no structure. Julian tried to create a little bit of a structure for paganism, but it wasn't really working. So the pagans were really unable to have a organized resistance in the face of all of this. And so we went to Syracuse, Sicily a couple of years ago, and it was just an amazing sight to see, where you take all of these Greek columns, you can see built into the wall of what became the cathedral, and what is now the cathedral in Syracuse. It was originally a temple of Athena, and for a little bit of time, because Sicily has had so much of an interesting and varied history, it spent time as a mosque, and it was also a Greek Orthodox church, now a Catholic church. Anyway, so these are some of my thoughts on how Constantine changed everything. So thank you for going with us. Got a little bit eclectic at the end, but hopefully you were able to follow all that. So Edward Preter had asked, do you think that Constantine's conversion was just pragmatic? And like I said, I don't really think it is, because I don't see why it would get him much. I know there's a bunch of, what ends up happening is when, from retrospect, because the position of everything becoming Christian within a century or so after that, it seems so inevitable. It seems like Constantine might have done it for just pragmatic reasons. In other words, everything was all going in that direction, but it was such a tiny percentage of the population. It's not like it's all the richest people or the most important people. or that he suddenly gained a bunch of shock troops or something. A lot of the Christians at the time are pacifists, and so not even really, I mean, there's some Christians in the army, but it's not like he suddenly gained a bunch of rich followers who had a big military or something that was very pragmatic. I mean, it's pragmatic in the sense of that he probably believed that the Christian God, he had a kind of a pagan view of maybe what the Christian God was doing, which is he did this thing. He had a vision, or he put the God symbol. He put the God symbol on their shields, and the God gave him victory. And so initially, I think he might have just. It's pragmatic in the sense that all pagan religion is pragmatic. That because he's getting victories by doing this, and so then he's following that path. He isn't initially like a soul Christian or a crazy zealous Christian. He's continuing to. Even after his first victory there, he's continuing to recognize other pagan gods, especially Sol Invictus, the unconquerable sun, and so forth. But I think over time, as he talks to more Christians, as he participates in the church councils and all those kind of things, I think he gets a better idea of what the whole thing is about. And I think probably, and again, if you count this to be pragmatism, or if you count this to be just what his understanding, his faith is, that he has to, as an emperor, he's involved in doing all kinds of acts that are not great, including ordering people to be killed, killing people in battle, and all these other kinds of things. He holds off on being baptized until late in life. With the hope that all of those sins that have been committed, all of the bad acts he's had to make pragmatically as a leader, realistically as a leader of an empire, that those will be washed away in his baptism. So I guess it means what you mean by pragmatic, but I don't think it's pragmatic in the sense of he gets something a lot important out of the Christians. Stephen Urbanik says, what are the myths about Constantine's conversion and what is the truth? Well, hopefully we've explained a lot of what we had about what my understanding of the truth of his conversion. There are myths, so people like to have conspiracy theories. There's a conspiracy theory that earlier Roman emperors created the whole Jesus story in order to dupe people or something like that. That's a myth. That's not true. It's a conspiracy theory. It's anachronistic. It doesn't have anything to do with the time period. I want to thank Edward Prater and Daryl Scott for supporting the channel. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it when folks donate. Leanne Berg asks, how did all these far-flung tetrarch rulers communicate with each other? Did any of them ever meet in person? They did. So at different times, so we had Galerius, who was the senior emperor, the senior Augustus in the east. He calls a colloquy, and they all get together and they meet together to try to reorganize the tetrarchy and so forth. All the ones that are in line with him, not the ones that are usurpers. And so they are doing that. They're communicating by post, by messengers. So there's the Roman Empire has a fast postal system. The Romans make roads. The Romans are very famous for roads. These roads have a primarily military function. So they made them. The government makes them in order to march their troops back and forth, and also to send messengers between the different army encampments. But then they get used by all the merchants and all the travelers too. So they end up, they have a military function or purpose, but then they have a bunch of extra functions that happen. So they're communicating that way. So they can't, it still takes a long time to get a message from Eboracum. So when Constantine declares himself Augustus, for that message to get all the way to Nicaea in Asia Minor, it's going to take a long time still. It can only go as fast as either the roads or boats get there. Rain asks, how did the Roman people and Senate view adult adoption as a means to inherit the title or name of Caesar. Was it seen as a political move or as a legitimate father-son relationship? So yeah, there is a big tradition in the Roman aristocracy to adopt adults and have them be your heirs. And so you can almost always see this originally in the in like a Roman name. So if you have a name like Julius, that's like a regular family name. If you're adopted in, it'll be like Julianus. Octavius would be the original name. If you're then adopted out of it, you'll become Octavianus. And so essentially, Julius Caesar, that's his, Gaius Julius Caesar is his Roman name. When he adopts his adult nephew in his will, Gaius Octavius, Octavius changes his name to Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. And so he called himself Caesar at that point, but we call him Octavian because everybody's calling themselves Caesar. So we try to differentiate between, everybody who's named Gaius Julius Caesar, like Caligula, so we use the word Caligula and so forth in order to differentiate these names. But it's very common. So we have lots of names like Fabian. That means adopted out of the Fabii clan, and Julian, like I said, and I'm trying to think, Claudian. There's just lots of these names that have the Aurelian, these names that have the IAN on them, and it's showing how common the practice is. And so this is, I think, partially it's pragmatic, but I think they really do kind of consider them to be your real heir. So there is in paganism especially, there is a loyalty to clan and name. And so, Caesar and the Julii, the Julii clan, Augustus ends up commissioning like Virgil to write the Aeneid to talk about like essentially the ancestors of the Julii, the legendary ancestors. And so Aeneas's son is named Iulus in the Aeneid, or becomes named that. And so he is the ancestor of the Julii, and so just having Julii, and so having the name be carried on is really important for these clans. And so I think that when you got adopted into that clan, you really are leaving your old clan behind, and you are really taking on that heritage and living it on and so forth. So I think that they do think that's legitimate. I don't know if it's a legitimate father-son relationship. It's a legitimate clan relationship where you and your descendants now are part of the clan you got adopted into instead of your old clan. Shipley Pibbles says, what was the religious landscape like at that point? What was left of older religions and cults at that point? So it was, under Constantine, it was left. It was all kind of still there. So Constantine did not outlaw the old religions. It's later emperors. It's Theodosius the Great who makes Christianity the state religion, and closes the academy and other pagan institutions, forbids rebuilding pagan temples, forbids eventually animal sacrifice and so forth. So that's in the centuries to come. And so at that point, so with Constantine, there is the Edict of Milan of his is a general tolerance. Everybody can be in your religion. You can be Christian or Jewish or worship the old gods as you will. And so most of them were all still hanging around and be just like they always had been. The difference would simply be you have fewer magistrates that are having the kind of great festivals that you would have had in the past. And so those are gone, but they could have still had some of the old, a lot of the old mystery cults would have still existed where you're getting initiated into them. A lot of the shrines would still exist, and so forth. So a lot, especially of the personal, individual, and familial practices and the superstitions, those would also all be maintained. So those would all still be there. They just slowly die out or killed out, stamped out. Christopher Benham says, how were the bishops who attended the Council of Nicaea chosen? And so in the old days, so it's very strange to me as a ancient historian and a medievalist that in the modern Catholic Church, the Pope gets to choose bishops. That was not how it worked. So each bishopric essentially has its own apostolic tradition that goes back to the first bishop, and so there is a local chapter, which is to say the elders and the other leaders in the and clergy in each bishopric, and either the preceding bishop has made, in some of the cases, has made their idea clear. They want to have such and so be the next bishop after they die, or the chapter elects them, or the people, the population of the bishopric popularly acclaim the person. So there's a bunch of different ways that the bishop would be chosen, but they would not have all been, they certainly wouldn't have all been picked by the Bishop of Rome or anything like that. So, he also asked, were there any Arius supporters at the Council of Nicaea? Arius was there himself. So yes, Arius and some of his supporters were there, but they were in the minority, and they lost the argument and had their position suppressed. Robert Garrison, would Christianity be what it is today without Constantine's conversion? Absolutely not. No. And so it's hard to know. I mean, it's a counterfactual. We don't know what Christianity would be like at all without without Constantine's conversion. So, so Christianity survived outside of the Roman Empire. So it had already been the state religion in Armenia, and so Christianity, could presumably have survived just in Armenia if the Roman Empire had become had developed its own, let's say, Roman world religion, and had ultimately become that Roman world religion could have ultimately become a persecuting religion. So, for example, in Chinese religion at a certain point didn't allow minority religions, and so there had been Manichaean and Jewish and Christian minorities that were kind of all exterminated in the Central Middle Ages. So it would have been possible that a kind of a pagan Roman world religion, a world religion based on the old gods and Greek and Roman philosophy, could have become a persecuting religion and have exterminated all of the Christians and Jews. And so they wouldn't have survived within the empire itself. But it's hard to know what might have happened. I mean, the Germanic tribes had already converted to Arianism, and so it's completely possible that there could have been Arian Christianity that is existing in Germany and Scandinavia. It's hard to know what would have happened or what it would be like. So it wouldn't be the same at all, and it wouldn't be so much about Nicene Christianity. There would be lots more varieties of it, but we don't know what it would be like. Stephen Urbanic says, was Christianity corrupted by paganism, as some Protestants claim it was, or was it a bottom-up phenomenon, was syncretism like this common? So Protestants at the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, and certainly true in my tradition, the Restoration tradition, saw all development in Christianity as corruption. And indeed, because Christianity absorbed so much in the way of previously pagan practices, and frankly the philosophy as theology, Greco-Roman philosophy as theology, and so forth, that's seen as like a falling away or corruption of essential Christian truths. But this lacks perspective, because already at its heart, at its foundation, of the very simple religion of Christianity is already it's already in a Hellenized society that has already been massively massively influenced by Greek thought, Greek philosophy. The Old Testament language and scriptures in the New Testament are all quoted in Greek. A lot of the Jewish ethical ideas, the idea of Christ as the Logos, all these things, these are all already massively influenced by Greek philosophy right at the very start. And even before the start of Christianity, so many of the ideas that are the hot button ideas of Second Temple Judaism, immortality of the soul, resurrection, apocalypse, rebirth of the world, a savior. All of these ideas are actually brought in. They're not original to the religion of Judaism. They are brought in from Mandaism or Zoroastrianism and other influences. So you can't ever. So this idea that the thing is corrupted is actually wrong. What we should probably understand is that we're all humans, part of a tradition where we are sharing ideas with each other, where some ideas seem to have meaning in our lives and some don't. And as they are exposed to different ideas, that stimulates our thinking. Everybody is responding to this, and syncretism, like you're saying, it's not only syncretism, but this kind of syncretism of ideas or sharing of ideas is simply the norm of how the history of ideas works. Edward Prater asks, how would you describe Western science in the context of world religions, given your evolutionary story of belief? So Western science, modern science, while it draws its inspiration from ancient Greek and Roman science, it's actually the direct offspring of medieval science. So the idea that modern people have that there was a Renaissance, which was literally a rebirth of classical civilization, and everything that went before that in the Middle Ages didn't count. That's a myth, a self-serving myth that is not true. In fact, actually, everything in the Renaissance is born immediately out of the context of the time period that happened right before it. And this is also true for modern Western science, which evolves not like the Romans, where the Romans have this, for example, this massive slave society where they don't need to worry about technology in terms of labor-saving devices. They brute force things. Instead, in the medieval context, when people were scarce and you didn't have like a million slaves to throw at a big public works project, you instead do things like invent and develop windmills and other kinds of things in order to have labor-saving devices. And the modern technical science kind of comes out of all of that practice. And Western science, while there's a big influence for Latin in the Latin university system and everything like that from the previous Jewish, but especially Islamic sources, so the Islamic philosophers who had access to Greek philosophy and things like that were influential in the Central Middle Ages for those ideas. The Western science is an invention of the medieval church, the medieval clerics, and the reason why, as is the university system, which is why when you graduate from a school, you put on those square hats and big black robes, because those are clerical robes. School is about the church. Scientific language is Latin, which is also the church language, because clerics and scientists were one and the same. So it is only in the most recent modernmost context in of the Enlightenment that there is a divergence between this, when essentially what I would say the clerics and established churches really took a wrong turn intellectually, and as a result of doubling down on some literalism and some ideas that have proved to be false ideas about history and things like that, they pushed people out because they locked into some definitions of what God and truth are that aren't correct. And so then people have sought truth outside of traditional religion, and that gives us our modern, particularly bizarre idea in the West about what religion is and what religion isn't, and so forth. Miguel Angel says, why wasn't Constantine made a saint after his death? How important do you consider Constantine's mother to be to later Christianity? So Constantine, I guess I'm not a Catholic, and so we don't really think of who the saints are and not. I don't know why he's not a saint. His mother is a saint, I think, Saint Helena, and so I guess Constantine's not, because we don't say Saint Constantine for him. I guess he's never. So the way you get to be a saint usually as a king or an emperor is that you have a later king or an emperor who want to have somebody as a model who they can more or less say that they are the heir to. And I would have thought that a bunch of later Roman emperors, especially in both the East and the West, would have wanted to say that about Constantine. Certainly Charlemagne gets to be sainted in some traditions because later German emperors want to look back on him as an august predecessor and so forth. So why Constantine per se? I don't know. He did too many bad things, and to make it not happen, and he didn't have a zealous enough successor to actually get it through the process. His mother is important, so we don't know what really caused Constantine's initial thinking into this thing. It might have been in the back of his head because his mother had planted that. That's often the case that in the history of Christianity and later conversions of kingdoms, that the women in the family get converted first. So a wife, a princess, a mother convert first, and then later bring their husband, son. Okay, there's a note here that Constantine is venerated as a saint in Eastern Christianity. So yeah, I would have thought he was. So never mind, he is. I don't know why he's not in the Catholic Church if he's not. But anyway, we're getting that as a note. So Saint Helena is important, and she ends up doing a bunch of important stuff once Constantine converts. And so, for example, she goes on a pilgrimage, which is essentially the first sort of religious tourism, where she goes to the Holy Land, and everybody who lives there identifies some rock or this or that as saying, this is such and such a historic site, this is where Jesus' tomb was, this is where this is and that is, and so forth. These become all of our traditional sites, and so all of the Christian shrines in Palestine, Israel, and the rest of the Middle East are based on early identifications like this, but there's not necessarily any particular reason to think that there's any historical continuity, as too many centuries have elapsed before the positions get fixed. But in any event, they have at least been venerated this many years, and so you can go there and understand them to be that, even if the historicity is not necessarily provable or not necessarily there. Daryl Scott asks, do many Protestant groups dislike Constantine for paving the way for the Catholic Church? Yes, I think so. So the part of, especially the Protestant, so Protestants had to break when they broke from Catholics, and when you do that, you end up having, anti-Catholic bias and also things you say against Catholics in order to say you're legitimate and they're not. And the Catholics do the same back and forth for the Protestants. And so for specific, so lots of Protestants see this as a fall away from the true traditions that had been existing before then, and certainly in the Restoration tradition that my church comes out of historically anyway, this Constantine is associated with what they called a great apostasy, essentially when the legitimate church ceases to exist and it needs to then be restored. And so yes, so that's an understanding. I don't see that way. I see this as being part of the long and complicated history of all of this. Nitsky89 says, early Christianity is often portrayed as the religion of the lower classes. Were there members of the elite who converted prior to Constantine? Yes, so there would have been some members of the elite who converted prior to Constantine. It's not, like I say, it's not a religion, though, of lots and lots of rich people. And so lots of the richest people did not convert until long after Constantine. And so, yes, the answer is that there would have been some, but there wouldn't have been enough to have it make a lot of sense for Constantine to convert for some kind of pragmatic reason about that. Edward Prater asks, is there no salvation without Jesus? So one of the ideas of Christianity is that salvation, comes through Jesus, or salvation comes through Christ, and this is expressed, for example, in the Gospel of John, and a lot of Christians will quote the phrase John 3:16, which is that God loved the world and gave His only begotten Son, that through Him all can be saved, and this kind of an idea. And then there's an idea that some Christians then have had, which is that unless you take the name of Christ, you can't be saved. And so in other words, that Christianity is exclusive, and the only people who will be saved are Christians. Not all Christians believe that. That's some Christians have that as their dogma. I personally don't believe that. I see Christ as, since I'm seeing Christ as part of the Trinity, in other words, through the traditional way that Christians view God, that Christ is more than simply Jesus, and since God is universal and the universe is a lot bigger than Earth or the Roman Empire or any part of our little bit of time and component in it, that the second person of the Trinity, the Logos, Christ, is known through many names, and is known and understood by people through many names and concepts in many different varieties, and so that there's more than one path through which people have salvation or have a meaningful life and that sort of thing. And so in other words, that I do not personally, in the same way that our church doesn't say that we are the one and only true denomination within Christianity, I also say that Christianity is not the one and only exclusively true religion, and you can very easily have salvation or a meaningful life, however you want to frame this sort of thing, life's purpose. You can have that outside of Christianity in Judaism, Islam, in Buddhism, in a purely secular spiritualism, as an atheist, and so forth, philosophically. So that's the end. Thank you so much for staying with us. People have been sharing some lecture ideas, and I appreciate that because we only have one more lecture, next week's lecture, listed out, and I'm going to have to come up with some more. So a lecture idea that someone has asked is the Holy Trinity. Oh, thank you. I've had so much trouble discussing the Holy Trinity, and we'll have to have a whole lecture on that. I will surely commit heresy if I do that, but you should probably do that. It's a good idea. The historical Joan of Arc is one. Ark of the Covenant theories. Well, I can talk about the Ark of the Covenant, and we can talk about the theories that people have about them and so forth. Baal Shem Tov and other claimants of the title Messiah. So that's interesting too. Yeah, there would be, I'm also thinking about a lecture on the Bar Kokhba revolt and so forth. You could also maybe have one. And there's a bunch of other different ideas. I appreciate all those ideas. Keep them coming. I'll be reading those in the comments. Like I say, save the date for our next lecture on the 4th of July. Why was the historical Jesus from Galilee? Thanks.